celebrate this really special moment with us. I'm Jill Hartz, the Executive Director of the museum. And this has been a long time coming. This is the first time we have presented a major exhibition of our Pierre Daura collection and that of the law school as well. And you will hear much more about that soon. But I want to thank Martha Daura and Tom Mapp for being here today with us, for celebrating this wonderful occasion, and for all the good work you do on behalf of Pierre Daura, and on behalf of our museum and many museums around this country that not just study Daura's work, but use that to show what museums can really do. So thank you. Wonderful gift of these artworks, we were then able to look at what we do next in terms of this museum crafting a program as a teaching museum that integrates theory and practice and draws upon the best resources we have in our community. So we worked with Phaedra Livingstone, who is the assistant professor in arts and administration and a museum studies professor who manages the museum certificates, and our own Danielle Knapp, who is our McCosh associate curator, and together they came up with a 3-term program of courses and practica that would take students, and the students come from all over at the university, through museums practice, learning how we put exhibitions together, studying the works, all of that, to come to the fruition of a wonderful exhibition and a beautiful catalog. So we have an early shipment of some of these, which we will have available tonight, and more are on their way. But I look at this catalog and I think, you'd say summer's here, but I would think spring's here. Maybe, you know, it's so warm out there. But I encourage you to read this from cover to cover because it represents the best of the University of Oregon students and shows you some really beautiful work. And this would not have happened without Danielle and Phaedra leading this effort. So let's thank them. We were going to do this, but could the students in these courses, anyone who's participated, even if you haven't been in a course, but have been working on this project, just stand so we know who you are. As well, so you can see all their names in here. This project, all of it from beginning to end, is made possible with university resources, including our new academic support grant and support from Academic Affairs, but also from the Daura Foundation, for which we are deeply grateful, and allows us to have a lasting document of what we're doing, because exhibitions come and go, but when you have a publication, you can always refer to that, so we're thrilled with that. We also have another program coming up on June 7th. I don't think Laura Waite is here yet, but she's in the music department and a vocalist, and she has put together a Spirited Bourrée concert and exhibition tour. So she and her students will be performing Catalan songs, and then we'll learn more about those songs and also look at them in relation to Pierre Daura's works. So that's going to be at 2 p.m. on Saturday, June 7th. So mark your calendars. That's an unusual opportunity, and we really love when we can partner with other areas in the university, and especially with other arts groups, and enriching our understanding of what's going on. So I think I am going to let Danielle take it away from there with everything else going on tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for such a warm welcome, Jill. I wonder if I should use this. Is this already on? Mm-hmm. I just want to say also how appreciative I am of everything that was made possible this year, thanks to my fellow colleagues at the museum and all the scholars we brought into our web as we were working with the students to do this research on the Daura artworks that are in the collection of the GSMA and the law school. I'm so honored to have Martha and Tom here tonight, and to have Dorothy Clark and her daughter Julia, the former dean of the law school, Chapin Clark. It was in his memory that these works came to us as a gift over 10 years ago. And so we had such a beautiful body of work to introduce to the students and give them this
first chance to do something really exciting, an interpretive exhibition over the course of an academic year about such an amazing, beautiful body of work that we have here. So we're so appreciative of that. And I am also so grateful to Dom Vetri and Jim Horstrup and everyone who's involved with the law school who made this possible for us to borrow so many works from them, which they have on view most of the time in their spaces. So we went through and took works that they love going to work every day and seeing and took them away and put them on our walls for the summer. So thank you for allowing us to include those in our exhibition. And we have a total of 20 students who took courses over the course of this year, in a fall, winter, and spring segment, and 10 to 13 students from the music school who will be doing the performance that Jill mentioned in June. So in total, 30 students directly involved in this project, countless others involved in different ways through their internships and their involvement at the museum, helping our staff with our day-to-day operations as we moved forward on making this exhibition real. In September, when we started our class, this came together from notes jotted down in our notebooks in our class, thinking, what would we do? How are we inspired by this material? And so now, tonight, when you go upstairs, you'll see what was the outcome of all the discussions since then. So tonight's program, we invited 3 speakers that the students selected specifically because of their breadth of knowledge and what they could contribute to the discussion about this world that Pierre Daura was a part of, helping us understand the context of his life and the artwork in our collection. So I just want to briefly introduce them before they speak. And then after their presentations, we have a very busy schedule tonight. So if we could hold questions till the end of their presentations, maybe take a few questions here, but then right away we'll want to go upstairs to the Focus Gallery where our students who are in attendance will briefly talk about some of the themes of the exhibition, highlight certain works, and then after their tour of the exhibition space, you're welcome to spend as much time in the gallery as you'd like talking to them. They're all wearing name tags or museum badges so you can identify who is involved in the project. But then we invite you to come downstairs and join us in a reception to cap off the night. Which is on, yes, so you will be here for the next 45 minutes or so. We'll go upstairs, and when you come down, go to the Pape reception hall for that event. So our speakers, I'll just introduce them all at once, and then I'll let you each go through your presentations. First will be Dr. Carmen Lord, who's an assistant professor of art history at the Pacific Northwest College of Art. She was invited to come in the fall and talk to our fall term students about the topic that she'll be briefly discussing today, which was a great experience 8 months ago, for that to be one of our introductions to Pierre Daura's early work. We'll have Dr. Cecilia Enjuto Rangel, who's a professor, an associate professor of Spanish here at the University of Oregon, who will talk about Pierre Daura and artists during the Spanish Civil War. And then we're delighted to have Dr. Barbara Rothermel, who's come all the way from the Daura Gallery at Lynchburg College, where she's also a professor of museum studies, to talk to us about Pierre Daura's life after moving to Virginia. And so it'll be a really great opportunity, if you know nothing about Pierre Daura's work, to be filled in with all of this wonderful context, and then go upstairs and get to see the work and hear the students talk about how it inspired them. So I've talked more than I meant to, but we're so glad you're here, and please help me welcome our first speaker, Dr. Carmen Lord.
Thank you. It's so wonderful to be here with you this evening. I'm especially grateful to the director of the Jordan Schnitzer Museum, Jill Hartz, and to curator Danielle Knapp for inviting me. We're so fortunate to have such an important collection of works by Pierre Daura at the University of Oregon, thanks to the generous donation of the painter's daughter, Martha Daura, with the support of Thomas Mack. I first met this wonderful couple around 1998 when I witnessed firsthand the brilliant way in which Tom facilitated the complicated process of the placement of Martha's father's work, around the United States and Europe. Because of them, now there is a rich human link between Daura, a friend to luminaries of early 20th century modernism, including Le Corbusier, Léger, Art, Kandinsky. Oh, excuse me. Because of them, now there's a rich human link between Daura, a friend to luminaries of early 20th century modernism, including Le Corbusier, Léger, Arp, Kandinsky, Mondrian, Van Tongerloo, and Pevsner, and the University of Oregon community. In this presentation, I'd like to briefly sketch Daura's roots in Spain, and especially the state of progressive art in that country prior to the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 39, events and personalities with which he would be intimately familiar. As we know, the greater part of Daura's mature career took place in France and the United States. However, Daura's formative experiences in Spain, and especially Barcelona, were of permanent importance to his artistic thinking. The artist Pedro Francisco Daura y García was born on the Spanish Mediterranean island of Menorca on February 21, 1896, indicated on the map on the screen, along with other important events relative to his life in Spain. While still an infant, his family moved to Barcelona, the capital of the province of Catalunya and the artistic and industrial center of modern Spain. Daura's father was a professional violinist with a distinguished Liceo orchestra, and his close friend, the cellist Pau Casals, became Daura's godfather. Pierre, or Pere, as he is known in Catalunya, received his artistic training at La Llotja. La Llotja was the most important art school in Barcelona, attended earlier by Picasso, and Picasso's father became one of Daura's teachers. At the age of 18, Daura made the first of his extended stays in France to work in the studio of post-impressionist painter Émile Bernard. Throughout the 1920s, Daura continued to exhibit in Barcelona with the group Agrupació d'Artistes Catalans, as well as in other European cities. Daura's Spanish ties remained important during his artistic life in Paris. The Uruguayan-born Spanish artist Joaquín Torres García was among those with whom he formed the group Cercle et Carré, Circle and Square, in 1929. In 1931, the monastery of Montserrat, an important intellectual and cultural center, awarded Daura the eminent St. Cecilia Prize, an important landmark in his professional career. As this suggests, Daura's oeuvre must at least in part be understood through the rich cultural background he inherited from his native Spain, and not only the context of French modernism. Key to this heritage was the intertwined identity of modernist art and politics in Spain, and especially Barcelona, which Daura and other vanguard Spanish artists of his generation absorbed. By the time he moved to France, Daura took with him understanding of the historiography of progressive art in Spain, which I want to touch on here. Between approximately 1888 and 1910, the so-called Modernista movement saturated most dimensions of artistic regional life in Catalunya, transforming literature, stage design, music, the decorative and graphic arts, painting, and architecture. Modernismo's figureheads included Antoni Gaudí, whose Sagrada Familia you may be familiar with, and which we see here on the right. Modernista painters were especially interested in contemporary subject matter, plein air technique, informality, and a more sketch-like application of paint than was taught at the academy. The center of Modernista activities was the Quatre Gats Café, the Four Cats Café, which we see at left, along with the cover of the journal published under its auspices. Picasso had one of his first exhibitions at this colorful site, and Daura's friend Joaquín Torres García, who worked with Gaudí on the Sagrada Familia, also frequented this popular café. During the same period of the late 19th to early 20th century, civil disturbances intensified in Barcelona, largely as a result of the labor movement and anarchist activity, which cycled with brutal official reprisals during this time period. Barcelona became widely known as the City of Bombs, and this violent contemporary history was the frequent subject of leading art of the period. On the screen, we see photographs of a meeting of laborers in Matosas during a textile strike in 1881 in Igualada, and a factory strike by women published in the newspaper La Actualidad in 1913. In keeping with this dynamic social context, the second generation of Modernista artists at the turn of the century explored the subject of the working poor even more aggressively. This group included Isidre Nonell, whose Poor Waiting for Soup of 1899 we see at lower left, and Pablo Picasso, whose great La Vie of the Cleveland Museum of Art of 1903 is visible at right. In Joaquim Mir's The Cathedral of the Poor of 1895, Barcelona's homeless are shown taking refuge by the Church of the Sagrada Familia, which had begun construction just a few years earlier. In the second decade of the 20th century in Spain, a new artistic movement known as Nocentismo emerged in reaction against Modernismo's perceived complexity and decadence. The philosophy of Nocentismo was expressed by classicism, balance, traditional values, and craftsmanship. It was also at times linked to political conservatism and nationalism. The followers of Nocentismo included Joaquim Sunyer and Josep Togores, whose work we see here, who sought to evoke ancient Mediterranean roots of the region in their work. Joaquim Torres Garcia, co-founder with Pierre Daura of the group Cercle et Carré in Paris, also made important contributions to Nocentismo. By the 1930s and up to the fall of the Second Republic in 1939, Barcelona was a hub for international avant-garde, with strong ties to anarchism and progressive social reform. The art dealer Josep Dalmau, whose undated portrait by Mela Mutter we see here, forged important contacts between the wider international art world and Spanish artistic circles. Among his many landmark contributions to national life is the exhibit of Cubist work he organized in 1912 in Barcelona, one of the first outside Paris at a time when Picasso and Braque were still actively exploring the implications of Cubism. The exhibit at the Daura Gallery included Marcel Duchamp's influential Nude Descending a Staircase, visible at left. Another formative influence on the Spanish avant-garde was the influx of foreign artists to Spain, escaping World War I in the teens of the century. This included Robert and Sonia Delaunay and Francis Picabia, whom Miró met in 1917. An enormous exhibit of French art organized by the Barcelona City Council in April 1917 also helped to generate a tipping point in Catalan artists' engagement with the cutting edge of the international art world. The artists associated with Barcelona during the rise of the avant-garde through the late 1930s included Pablo Gargallo, a sculptor specializing in metalwork whose magnificent The Prophet of 1933 we see at center, alongside his portrait of Picasso in fired clay. During his long career, Gargallo transitioned through modernism and Nocentismo, in addition to being among the first Catalan artists to explore the radicalizing implications of Picasso and Braque's Cubism for sculpture. At right, we see Woman with Hair in a Bun of 1929 to 34 by Julio González, who also belongs to this generation. Like Daura, Miró, Dalí, and Picasso maintained strong ties to Barcelona and Spain while living in France. Inspired by regional landscape, Romanesque art, and folklore, as well as Cubism, Joan Miró's work was first exhibited in a show organized by Josep Dalmau. Dalí's residence in Spain brought a steady stream of international surrealists to Cadaqués and Barcelona throughout the 1920s and 30s. Picasso and Miró's early involvement in the surrealist movement also influenced Barcelona galleries and Spanish art publications, which in turn also impacted the next generation of artists. By the 1930s, Daura's life at the site of his American wife Louise and their child Martha was privately and professionally well established in France. He had also begun extended visits to the United States, which eventually led to his move there with his family. Nonetheless, Daura continued to identify with cultural and political developments in Spain and was deeply disturbed by the unfolding civil war, which devastated his country between 1936 to 39. By 1937, it was clear that the elected Republican government's war effort there and the progressive social reforms it represented stood in grave danger of collapse under the attack of nationalist forces receiving the formidable support of both Hitler and Mussolini. Thus, in 1937, at the age of 41, Daura left his family in France to enlist in the Spanish Republican Army to fight against fascism. On the screen, you see two of the works inspired by that experience. When the Spanish Republic fell to the nationalists in 1939, Daura gave up his Spanish citizenship. He never again returned to Spain. In the aftermath, the victor of that war, General Francisco Franco, methodically set about destroying evidence of Spain's important modern art movement, and in particular Barcelona's contribution of the preceding decades. It was impossible to openly begin work of recovering the memory, records, and objects of that cultural history in Spain, and especially in Catalonia, of such importance to Daura's formation until after the death of Franco in 1975. It is a work that continues to present day. Thank you.
Oh, okay. There you go. Thank you so much for inviting me. This is a great honor. Thank you, Carmen, for finishing with the Spanish Civil War, since that's what I'm going to start with. I'm actually going to give you a brief overview of the historical context of the Spanish Civil War and Pierre Daura's war experiences. Okay, I'll just start. The Second Spanish Republic from 1931 to 1939 emerged with the abdication of King Alfonso XIII and the implementation of a democratic system with diverse political parties, from the right-wing Acción Católica to the Socialist Party. In the first years of the Republic, the Socialists were in power, and they tried to implement a series of social and political reforms, such as land reforms, the secularization of the public education system, the right to divorce, female suffrage, more autonomy for the Basque, Catalan, and Galicians, that would therefore make Spain a lay modern state. The separation of the church and the state threatened the political establishment of the Catholic Church and its control over the education of the country. However, paradoxically, with the support of the new women voters, the Catholic coalition won the elections of 1933. Thus, many of those social and political reforms were halted, and Spain became more and more divided. As Gabriel Jackson explains, and therefore this quote, in October 1939, a divided and fearful left rose against a government which seemed to be drifting in the direction of clerical fascism, end of quote. Armed miners had fought for 2 weeks in Oviedo, Asturias, but their rebellion was suppressed by Moroccans and by the Moroccan and Foreign Legion. Among its military officers, Francisco Franco stood out. The miners and the political organizers were brutally persecuted. The class and ideological confrontations in Asturias prefigured those of the Civil War. In February, so the whole point is I don't want to give you an idealist vision of Spain as one that it was that where everyone was a socialist throughout from 1931 to 1936. There were different parties in different moments who were in control of the government, and therefore it had to confront many social problems and political conflicts. In February of 1936, a leftist coalition, El Frente Popular, won the elections and defeated the right-wing coalition, El Bloque Nacional, who obviously didn't like that and delegitimized the elections, and tensions escalated and street violence became rampant. The Spanish Civil War lasted from 1936 to 1931, and it began with a golpe de Estado, a fascist military coup in July 17th and July 18th against the democratic regime of the Republic. The coup d'etat developed into a full-scale civil war, largely because of international intervention, or lack thereof, as Gabriel Jackson succinctly explains, and this is the longest quote. The Republican cause depended heavily upon Russian armaments, aviators, tank drivers, and staff officers. Between 30 and 40,000 anti-fascist volunteers flocking to Spain against the will of their governments fought in the Republican ranks. The forces under General Francisco Franco, known variously as insurgents or nationalists, depended increasingly through the war on the armed aid of Italy, Germany, and Portugal. End of quote. The war was both a national crisis and an international event, with multiple repercussions beyond the Spanish boundaries. Even though the Soviet Union, and in the first year of the war, the international brigades, committed their effort to support the Republic, the majority of the international community abandoned the Spanish democratic system through the Pact of Non-Intervention. The Republicans were struggling to arm and train the people, in contrast to the insurgents who relied on the experience of a great part of a professional army and on the financial and military support of Hitler and Mussolini. Even though the Soviet Union did ultimately support the Republican cause, they didn't really provide them with the real military support they needed to win the war. In a way, the Pact of Non-Intervention was one of the key factors that determined the political and military collapse of the Republic, who from 1937 until 1939 struggled to survive the material crisis of shortage, inflation, population dislocation, starvation, and threatening epidemic disease. Furthermore, the Foreign Legion, or the insurgents, approached the war in Spain, in the mainland, as another colonial war, where Moroccan mercenaries were used and abused, trained to carry out the same violent military tactics their Moroccan counterparts had been subjected to by the Spanish military that they tried to hold on to, as they tried to hold on to the remnants of its crumbled imperial status. The Catholic Church, paradoxically so deeply politicized and so estranged from the democratic political process, also blessed the insurgents as a whole, the fascists, the Catholic conservatives, the phalangists, calling the war a new crusade against the atheists. The church, and I'm just going to give you an overview of who represents who. So the insurgents or rebels versus the Republicans. So the church became, therefore, an institutional buttress that offered a spiritual justification for the nationalist cause. Throughout this talk, I will refer to the troops led by Franco and other military leaders as insurgents, or as nationalists in quotation marks, because I find, along with many other scholars, that the term nationalists is how the insurgents liked to call themselves, to imply they were the ones fighting for the nation, and easily therefore extrapolate that the anti-nationalists were anti-Spanish. Furthermore, referring to the rebels or insurgents as nationalists is also problematic in my view and others, because there were Basque and Catalan nationalists fighting for the Republic, among them Pierre Daura. Summarizing the complexities that entangled the Spanish Civil War and its historical and political cultural repercussions in just a few pages is, to say the least, a difficult task. But as Helen Graham describes, I quote, "The military coup unleashed what was in effect a series of culture wars, urban culture and cosmopolitan lifestyle versus rural tradition, secular against religious, authoritarianism against liberal political cultures, center versus periphery, traditional gender roles versus the new woman." Therefore, here we see una miliciana. End of quote. Although reducing the culture wars into a group of opposing factors can also be a contentious task, and those juxtapositions not always help us explain a very divided left and right, they can also be useful when it comes to trying to situate the war beyond the political and military sphere. Throughout the war, General Francisco Franco tried to unite the various conservative families, the monarchists, the Carlists, the Phalangists, the fascists, under the rubric of anti-republicanism that merged itself with the protection of Catholic, quote, traditional values and the abhorrence of their common enemy, symbolized as all Republicans. And these are communists, socialists, anarchists, liberals, Freemasons, atheists, Jews, Basques, Catalans, Galician nationalists, obviously Democrats. Officially, the war ended in April 1939, when the insurgents' victory constituted the new state, Franco's dictatorship. Yet, the Republican guerrilleros, or maquis, with the support of the Communist Party, continued to wage war on the regime under really precarious conditions for almost 12 years after the end of war. To this day, the numbers, I have another quote that I'm not quoting, but I was just interested in this concept of demonizing the other, which both parties and both movements do, actually. But to this day, the numbers vary, but most historians agree that political prisoners by the end of 1939 were 270,000, of which many were sentenced to prison or death, and around 20,000 were sentenced to a slow death, forced labor in the Valle de los Caídos, the Valley of the Fallen, the sheer rock monument to the victors. Franco's regime implemented a totalitarian system of which close to 200,000 people were executed and hundreds of thousands were imprisoned. 500,000 Spaniards were sent into exile in Mexico, Chile, the United States, and other parts of Europe like France and England. Among them, also Pierre Daura, who, loyal to his political convictions, never returned to Spain. Franco's military dictatorship and his authoritarian regime was by far the most centralized in Spanish history. Its centralization and totalitarian practices were cemented in a terrible system of state repression blessed by the Catholic Church, from linguistic and cultural repression in the case of the speakers of Catalan, Basque, and Galician, to ideological and military persecution of anyone who could be suspected of treason in the new regime. Franco continuously legitimized his use of absolute control by delegitimizing the democratic distribution of power through an electoral system. The nationalists, dead or alive, had a place in that social sphere, while Republicans, the vanquished, the vanished, ostracized, persecuted, literally and metaphorically, were always displaced. And this is when I start talking about Pierre Daura, who actually lived in France since 1914, as Carmen was talking about. But even if you live abroad and you change your name, you don't really stop being who you are. And he clearly felt that as a Catalan, it was his duty to defend the Republic during the Spanish Civil War. As his wife, Louise Blair, recalls, and this is the next quote, as she recalls how she tried to convince him not to go to war, Pierre answered, "It is my fight. I am Spanish. I believe in the Republic. I must fight for it." End of quote. He lived a comfortable life with his family in Saint-Cirque, France, but during the war period, staying idle and comfortable was not an option for those who truly understood the very real threat of fascism. Daura was among the many artists who openly supported the Republic, such as Picasso and Miro, and we have very interesting exhibition of solidarity upstairs that talks about that. And also writers such as Langston Hughes, Ernest Hemingway, Pablo Neruda, Cesar Vallejo, among them, and among many others who actually met in 1937 in the Congress of Anti-Fascist Writers in Valencia. But honestly, just as Miguel Hernández, one of the Spanish most important poets, Daura was among the very, very few who actually fought in the front. So there was a lot of support and solidarity, but actually fighting in the military front required a special kind of courage. In 1937, Daura went to Barcelona and offered his services to a Republican colonel who asked him to take charge of an observation post in Teruel, since Daura had been trained as an artilleryman during his military service when he was young. He had a disabled arm, so he knew he would not be able to participate in active combat, but nevertheless, he courageously went to the front. As Virginia Irby Davis explains in her biography, he arrived to Teruel and realized the terrible conditions these Republican soldiers were facing. And this is a self-portrait of Daura in his militia uniform. And this is the quote that I'm quoting right now from his diary, or from the biography, I mean. He spent 10 days in his tweed suit and low shoes because there weren't any uniforms. He got a pair of boots, but a comrade stole them the next day. The food day after day was lentils, bread, Russian butter, and vodka. No sugar, no coffee, no cigarettes, and wine only once a week. End of quote. The lack of supplies in the Republican side is clearly a product of the non-intervention pact, the pact from, the pact that the U.S., the England, and France did not to support the Republic. And therefore, this created a political and military isolation that created that hunger and that lack of supplies. I quote, "He was with his telephone and his telescope in a post high on the mountainside, 2 miles from the front lines, an observer for an artillery unit encamped near the town of Teruel. His job was to keep in touch with every post in the sector and to direct and correct the fire of the gun batteries," end of quote. His war experiences are also movingly told through his letters and drawings, where, as Teresa Macia explains, he would depict, I quote, "the tent where he slept, the lamb that became the unit mascot, Mosquita, his comrades, etc." He explained to Louise how he would often read Margaret Mitchell's novel, Gone with the Wind, to his fellow soldiers. Daura, therefore, remained at the front until he was wounded in the legs and the left arm. Because of these wounds, he was sent back to France, and as soon as he was able, he started to help again those who were fleeing the war. In 1939, he was particularly outraged by the inhumane conditions that the Republican refugees had to endure in the concentration camps. And this is a quote from a letter and from the biography of Davis, At Argels, on a bare expanse of sand between the sea and the barbed wire barricades, such as those used against enemy tanks, were huddled more than 100,000 Spaniards. No shelter, not even tents for the wounded, no blankets, only their ragged clothes to cover them. For food, a ration of 2 ounces of dry bread a day. At night, they dug holes in the sand trying to escape the bone-chilling wind. Hundreds died. Many committed suicide. To conclude, I briefly want to mention Daura's etching titled Spanish Civil War, Argels, 1939, that you'll see upstairs in the exhibition, where the refugees appear as Christ figures holding the barbed wire as the crown of thorns, as the crown of thorns frames this depiction of the Holy Family. The feminization of Spain as a Mater Dolorosa and the use of Christ figures is very much in dialogue with what other artists and poets, such as Cesar Vallejo, for example, the Peruvian poet, were doing at the time in support of the Spanish Civil War. This etching does not mean a return to religious solace and motifs as a part of his post-war trauma. In a war where the Catholic Church and the fascists had demonized the political other as Republican atheists, Daura's political statement of showing the Republicans as the true spiritual symbols of what is holy and of Christ's suffering and redemption demonstrates the depth of his critique to the fascist monopoly of those symbols. Thank you.
Looks good. Thank you. Well, good evening. I am going to talk with you about Pierre Daura when he came to Virginia. But to begin, by the time Pierre Daura came to Virginia in 1934, he had already had a lifetime of experiences. He had been introduced to the world of art and to the performing arts by his father and by his godfather, Pablo Casals, who performed with Barcelona Orchestra. He had studied at the famed art school, La Rioja, in Barcelona with José Calvo and José Ruiz Blasco, Picasso's father. He had rented an art studio at the age of 14 with two of his friends. He sold his first painting in their inaugural exhibition because it reminded the purchaser of a Cézanne. He moved to Paris to pursue an art career with letters of introduction from Calvo. He had worked in the studio of the French post-impressionist Émile Bernard, cataloging the letters of Vincent van Gogh. He had studied engraving with André Lambert, editor of Janus, a magazine published in Latin. He had served compulsory military service in his native Minorca. I think this is a particularly dashing photograph. He had lived in Montmartre. He had exhibited in Barcelona, Amsterdam, and Paris. He had met and married the American art student Louise Heron Blair, who became his muse. This portrait of Louise in Asturian costume is possibly done during their honeymoon in Spain. He had arranged the first Paris exhibition of works by the Uruguayan artist Joaquim Torres Garcia. Excuse me just a moment while I have a tickle in my throat. Excuse me. He had formed the group Cercle Carré with Torres Garcia, Michel Souffleur, and others to promote geometric construction and abstraction, as opposed to the irrationality of surrealism. He and Louise had purchased a 13th century home in the French village of Saint-Cirque-la-Popie. He and Louise had welcomed their only child, Martha, born in 1930. She became his second muse. He had won the Saint Cecilia Prize in a major competition at the Monastery of Montserrat. And then in 1934, he, Louise, and Martha traveled to Virginia to visit Louise's relatives. They spent time with family in Richmond, which is here, and in Rockbridge Baths, which is up here in the mountains. It's a tiny town in the Blue Ridge Mountains where Louise's mother owned property that had been a hotel with springs that were believed to have healing properties. We have images of the vistas of the Blue Ridge Mountains and of the rivers. Her mother gave them property that included an old ice house and a log cabin as a wedding gift. Daura was fascinated with the mountains and valleys of Western Virginia, especially autumn colors. Scenes of this landscape became a principal subject in his work. After their return to Europe in 1935, many of his Virginia landscapes were sold at an exhibition in Barcelona. The Dauras settled back into Saint-Cirque, but in July 1936, news reached them of the outbreak of civil war in Spain. At the age of 41, he joined the Republican Army, as we have heard. He served as a forward artillery observer until wounded in his already crippled left arm and was returned to France. Again, many of the works of this period document his experiences and subsequent efforts to assist Spanish refugees held in compounds in southern France. In 1939, Louise became seriously ill, and the decision was made to return to Virginia. Because he had refused to return to Spain after Franco's victory, his Spanish citizenship and that of Martha was revoked, necessitating their travel on a Nansen passport, which is an internationally recognized refugee travel document that was at that time issued by the League of Nations to stateless refugees. Louise recovered, but the outbreak of World War II prevented them from returning to Europe, and they settled once again in Rockbridge Baths at their cabin. The rolling landscapes of Virginia, with its rivers and its farms, its barns and its cattle, and farm workers, provided a new inspiration for Daura's work. He wrote, "This village of Rockbridge Baths, it produced in me the impression of a very wild, savage country, like nothing I had ever known. Yet in some places, I thought of the Lot Valley in France." Daura's work soon came to the attention of museums, galleries, and the public, and an exhibition was formed in Richmond and Hopewell, Virginia. His first solo exhibition, held at the Lynchburg Art Gallery, opened on December 7th, 1941. An awkward day for an art celebration, of course, as this was the day the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. In 1942, 46 of his paintings and drawings were exhibited at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond, along with 38 abstract compositions by his brother-in-law, Jean Elion. In 1936, Elion had moved to the United States with his wife, Jean Blair, Louise's sister. He had established studios in New York and Rockbridge Baths, but soon returned in 1940 to France to join in the war effort. During this time in Virginia, Louise taught at a local high school, and Daura gave art lessons. One of his pupils was a young Cy Twombly, a native of Lexington, which was just 14 miles away. Twombly continued to study with Daura until he graduated from high school. In 1945, the Dauras moved to an apartment in Lynchburg, Virginia, on the eastern side of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Martha was entering college, and anyone who has sent a child to college knows what this entails. He needed to make some extra money, and did so as an art teacher. From 1945 until 46, he was chair of the art department at Lynchburg College, and then an instructor at Randolph-Macon Women's College, where he remained until 1953. It was there where he met Queena Stovall, 62-year-old woman from rural Virginia. When her family was young, Queena Stovall expressed her creativity by sewing and painting floral and fruit designs on trays, plates, and chairs. It wasn't until her children were grown and her life slowed down that she began to paint scenes in oils. Her brother encouraged her to enroll in an art class being taught by Daura at Randolph-Macon Women's College. The first assignment for the class was to paint a picture of what Christmas meant to them. As Queena recalled, "Lord, the only thing Christmas means to me is hog killing. Everybody in the country has to have a little fresh meat for Christmas." Daura encouraged Queena to keep painting, but told her not to attend any more classes so she would retain her own vision and style. She went on to paint 48 folk scenes of life in rural Western Virginia and became dubbed the Grandma Moses of Virginia. In 1959, Daura had a new house and studio built beside the hot springs in Rockbridge Baths. During these later years of his life, he devoted himself to painting every day. His oils and prolific output of watercolors demonstrate his deep involvement with the rural scene in all its aspects. Simple tasks such as burning brush and plowing, houses, outbuildings, and livestock of neighboring farms, moods of the changing seasons, and the landscape itself, country roads, woodlands, the majestic presence of jump and house mountains. These motifs he painted over and over, seeing his landscape paintings as, he said, an important contribution to help people discover the beauty of their land, to inspire men with a love of their native soil. Late in his life, Daura stated, and I quote, "All I have ever wanted to do is find a way to paint. I have painted, I have worked, I have given myself to my art. That is what I have wanted since my very early age. That is what I am." Daura continued to paint, to draw, and to sculpt. He constantly re-examined the familiar in still life, the abstract quality of nature, as we see here in Natural Bridge Fugue, the human condition as found in his sculpture of St. John the Baptist, the village of Saint-Cirque, and occasionally painting a portrait for someone he may have known, as we see here. He created Christmas cards every year that were sent to family and friends. And the rolling vistas of rural Virginia that remained a constant source of inspiration in these later years of his career. Thank you.
Thank you all. It's wonderful. Unless there are any pressing questions you wanted to ask any of our speakers right now, we certainly have a few moments to do so. Otherwise, though, I would say we should move up to the gallery where we could start in the next 5 to 10 minutes with the students' presentations, and you'll have opportunities after they speak about the show to talk to all of our students and speakers if you have one-on-one questions and discussions. But I don't want you to miss the opportunity right now if there's something that's pressing that you wanted to ask while we're in this room.
Question. I notice on some of these works there are 2 days. There's a long period for when he may have started the work, but it may be even 15 years later that the second day occurs. Does that mean he's always reworking his work?
No,
We don't know.
So just in case anyone couldn't hear that, Pierre Daura rarely dated
His work, so many of the works that came to us in this gift and other museums, we might only know the span of time in which it was created because we know that he created it while living at Rockbridge Baths or while he was in France. So the dates you see on the labels upstairs and in our catalog reflect the period in which the works happened, not necessarily a full span of time on which they were reworked over a decade. That's an important distinction to make. I'm glad you asked that.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. This is our exhibition, Placing Pierre Daura. I'm Victoria Reese, an undergraduate in the art history department, and along with many other students have curated this exhibition we are standing in right now from start to finish. And over the last several months, we have researched Pierre Daura, and through this lively body of work, we have become well acquainted with him, the man and the artist. And I speak for all of us when I say that we are thrilled to introduce him to you today. The exhibition title, Placing Pierre Daura, has many levels of significance, not the least of which is how difficult it is to name an exhibition, as we learned throughout the course. I wish you guys could all see how many titles almost went up on this wall. Actually, I don't, but it was definitely quite the process, and the title we ended up with is referring not only to the many geographic locations in which Pierre Daura lived, but also the mental and emotional location throughout his life, throughout the many relocations and reformations of himself. Okay. It is Daura's process of identity formation that we chose to build our thematic framework around, and he was a deeply introspective individual. His art was reflective of his enduring process of personal inquiry. I don't mean to give you the sense that he was at all self-absorbed or, introverted. I must stress that he couldn't be further from that. What was most clear from my research was that Daura lived his life for others, whether family, friends, neighbors, or compatriots. He meant a great deal to a great many people and continues to. Taking this into consideration, we chose to interpret his life and his art, for Daura, life and art were one and the same, through three major motivating forces: his devotion to his family, his engagement with various artistic communities, and his evolving nationality from a Spanish Catalan to American citizen. Why we chose these three themes as the primary influences of his life practice, my fellow student curators will explain further in depth right after Merritt goes into more of our process and behind-the-scenes experience. Yes, okay, here, we'll take this. Okay.
Hello, my name is Merritt Thompson. I'm an undergrad art history major as well. And I think it's important to talk about our process, mostly because it wasn't necessarily a traditional process for curating. I think it was definitely a group activity every day, a lot different than a single curator thinking of ideas. I personally enjoyed it very much. We were allowed to bounce ideas off each other, everyone kind of working together to create this, in my opinion, excellent exhibition. So fall term, we started with a lot of research. We read books, we watched documentaries, we listened to people talk about Pierre Daura. We also got many visits from people who work in this museum, kind of giving us a background of information of what actually goes into this curatorial process, and it's not just the curators working up here. So we did a lot of that. We also, near the end of our term, split into small groups and developed some themes. I think as a group, we developed three themes, and then we passed those three themes on to the next term, winter term, and we then voted on, as a group, which one we liked the best, which, in turn created the show. During the winter term, we also were given assignments such as an exhibition interpretation and our final exhibition design, which you see it's been changed a little bit, but this is a varied version of that. And then finally this term in the spring, we focused a lot of our public programming, public programming, which is this right now. We watched installation, helped with lighting, learned about ways in which we can hang things on the walls, spacing, what can go on top of each other, what should be spatially close to each other. And we thank you all for coming so much. It means a lot to us that we have this many people here supporting us. And it was such a great class. We all were able to kind of apply things that we had learned in classes into a hands-on experience. So this is Lindsay. She's going to talk about nationality.
Okay, so my name is Lindsay Keast. I'm a second-year art history graduate student. I'm going to speak to you about nationality. Please forgive me, I did my thesis defense today, so I'm a little brain dead. I'm doing my best. So with roots buried deep in Catalonia, France, and the United States, the determination of a single nationality was a really difficult task for Pierre Daura. At the onset of the Spanish Civil War, Daura found himself fighting proudly on the Republican front, defending Catalonia's rich cultural heritage. Daura had returned from France to fight in the war, feeling a strong obligation to protect the land of his childhood. Though Daura had moved from Spain to France, had begun using the French version of his name, and even had supported France in World War I, it was clear his pride remained rooted in Catalonia. Daura had served in wars before, but nothing had prepared him to fight on the fronts of the Spanish Civil War. Daura was haunted by the desecration of his homeland and the horrific treatment of his people. Many of his sketches, paintings, and prints produced between 1937 and 1939 are dark and moody with grayed hues and desolate backgrounds. Faced with a losing battle and an ill wife, he retreated to Virginia as a sanctuary to wait out the regime threatening to erase his cultural heritage. Amidst the devastation of the war, Daura found hope in artistic explorations of Christian themes, preserving his intimate connection with the Pyrenees frescoes of his homeland. Most prominent among his depictions is his repetition of Pietas and the images of lamentation, such as the oil painting titled Pietà from Rubio, created sometime after 1939, which is on the wall behind Phaedra. The overwhelming sadness portrayed in this piece alludes not only to the depression Daura felt during the war, but might also represent the lamentable consequences of the war on the Catalan people. Though Virginia offered a safe haven during World War II, it was ultimately Saint-Cirq-le-Popie where Daura was drawn in his later years as an emblem of serenity and an ideal home for the summers of his old age. The church, a gleaming idol in the center of Saint-Cirq, becomes Daura's own personal icon of home. Its timelessness, a symbol of perseverance and determination, established for Daura the consistency he sought in his identification of self. In some ways, we can say that Daura felt lost and that his nationality was shattered. But it could also be said that Daura embraced these three nations as they formed very important aspects of his identity. Migrating between Catalonia, France, and the United States had taken its toll on Daura's alignment with his nationality, and it seems, with his admiration of the Saint-Cirq Church, Daura had finally found a place to call home. Sorry, it's sweaty.
Yeah, it's quite a pincher. Okay. Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm an undergraduate student in anthropology and folklore. So this class is a little bit of an excursion for me, but it's been a wonderful one. I'm here to talk with you about Pierre Daura's relationship with community. So Pierre Daura was fortunate in that he knew from a very young age what he wanted to do in life. As Carmen Lord and a few of our other presenters mentioned, he wanted to be an artist and he wanted to paint, and he did throughout his entire life. It's something he did wherever he went. Whenever he did, he continued to paint, and he took that passion with him. And although place impacted Daura, Daura also impacted place, and this is something that has become clear as we look at his relationship with the various communities of which he was a part. So as a young man in Paris, Daura was a founding member of Cercle Carré, a group of artists pursuing geometric constructivism and abstraction. This group included several artists, among them Joaquin Torres Garcia, Wassily Kandinsky. They banded together after their artworks were rejected from a very prestigious Salon d'Automne and decided to present something together. Although their group was short-lived, they made an important impact on the art scene of Paris in the 1920s, of which Daura was a big part. sorry, that came out wrong. But he made a big impact on the Parisian art scene of the 1920s. It was an important stretch of time for him where he contributed to a community of artists as one of their own. In 1930, the Dauras moved to Saint-Cirque, a small medieval town in the Lot Valley of southwestern France. Their presence reinvigorated the community there, drew other artists, notably André Breton, who was a very famous surrealist poet who became a neighbor and friend to Pierre Daura. Daura painted Saint-Cirque often from 1930 until his death in 1976, and Martha, Daura's only child, donated their family home in Saint-Cirque as an artist residence, where it continues to be used in the pursuit of art and artistic community to this day. When Daura volunteered as a forward artillery observer in 1937 to fight for the Republic during the Spanish Civil War, he created sketches and etchings of his fellow soldiers, becoming known as Grandfather for his 41 years of age and his habit of reading chapters aloud from Gone with the Wind to his company. When the Dauras moved to Virginia, they built up a community in Rockbridge, Bass, and again in Lynchburg when Daura took up teaching. He was a man who traveled through life with a kindness for others, a man of whom I have never, in my many months of research, read a harsh word. Below is a quote outlining his desire to create a sense of community no matter the place. And this is about Rockbridge, Bass in Virginia. When my neighbors go hunting, I go. When they kill hogs, I go. When they shuck corn, I go. It is in this way that I get to know them. Otherwise, I would live with them for years and still be a stranger. Wherever he traveled, Daura fostered a long list of friendships and contributed to various communities throughout his life across the three nations. Okay.
Hello, my name's Erin, and I'm also an undergrad in art history. And I'm going to talk for just a little bit about the third theme that we chose for our exhibition, which is family. And in my, minute and a half that I have, if you take one thing away from my talk today, I hope that it's just the incredible importance that family had to Daura, both personally and artistically. So I think that you can't really talk about Daura's identity unless you talk about his roles as a husband and a father. So we decided to put the paintings and drawings of Martha and Louise specifically kind of all throughout the exhibition, just to show kind of how often he painted them, how important they were in his artistic career, and that it didn't really matter where he was, they were always present in terms of his artistic life and home life. So, and I think that you can really see that, particularly in these paintings and drawings, in the detail and care that he used to depict them. So that's kind of the gist of my very short talk. But I do want to say that family was a very stable part of Daura's life. So even though we talked about kind of the troubles and the difficulties in nationality and all these other areas of his life, his family was always there and always a very stable and constant part of his life. So the last thing I want to say very quickly is that we've got 2 paintings that are going to be going on loan before the end of the exhibition. You still have lots of time to see them. They don't leave for a while. But just to make sure that you go and check out the small portrait of Louise right over there. Yeah, in the corner. And then also right behind us, Daura, Cain and Family. That one. So, thanks. Yeah.
Okay, hi everybody. My name is Lauren Zumita. I'm a second-year master's student in the art history department. So if you go outside of the walls of this exhibit, out into the hallway, basically on the other side of this wall, you'll see a series of etchings, and each one of them is by a different artist. And you might recognize a couple of the names. Picasso and Miro are probably 2 of the biggest. But one of them is Stanley William Hayter, and he is probably, we can in a way consider him to be responsible for the creation of that portfolio. In 1927 in Paris, he founded a studio, which was called Atelier 17. And that was a place where, at that time, artists in the community could come and work together and learn from each other in the different printmaking practices. So you might notice if you go out and look at the labels that none of those pieces were created by Daura. So you might ask, well, what does this have to do with the exhibition inside the Focus Gallery? We had a couple of very illuminating guest speakers downstairs kind of illustrate the importance of the Spanish Civil War to Daura and his life. So all of the pieces in the hallway were also created in response to the Spanish Civil War. The portfolio was created basically to raise funds for the support of the Republican cause, which was the side that Daura was on and was also the losing side. So we can think of it as basically a contextual aid for understanding Daura and his life. So when the opportunity to present those works in conjunction with this exhibition opened up, we, of course, jumped at the chance. And I think another really interesting thing that we can see by those etchings out in the hallway, they're done with some very obvious surrealist influences. And that's something that we've also mentioned was in Paris in the 1920s, was a really big artistic practice, and something that Daura and in conjunction with his group Circle and Square, he worked alongside, and some might say in opposition to, but I think all of those circles kind of run together. So you can see right here we have one example of a geometric piece that you can think about when you go out into the hallway and look at the surrealist etchings. But I think that the etchings out in the hallway are a really nice example of sort of the idea of a crossing of national boundaries or an overcoming of that. So the artists out in the hallway come from all over. They're from London, from Spain, from Canada even. So I think that's a really nice mirror to what to Daura's life and the fact that he had all of these different nationalities that helped make up his identity. Yeah, so I think, thank you for listening. If you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer them, unless Danielle has some other plans for us.
Definitely questions would be great, or one-on-one questions too. And I just want to remind everyone that when you're done looking at the exhibition and speaking with our curators and our presenters, to join us in the Pape for a reception and have some food and have a drink and talk to everyone and celebrate their accomplishments.